The next 30 years are going to be the most dangerous in history. So it's great to be here to join you in celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Swiss Economic Forum. And obviously, a lot has changed in the last 25 years. When I was a young man, I always thought that this photograph was, I broke the slides already. Okay, this photograph was going to be the sort of defining geopolitical image of my lifetime, the Berlin Wall coming down. I'm now beginning to suspect I might have been wrong about that. Increasingly, it's feeling more like this graph that you see here. This is the defining geopolitical image of our lifetimes. It's an attempt to estimate, map out the proportion of world GDP produced in different regions, and basically it's designed to show you the return to great power status of China. And this is something, I think the best description of this that I've seen came from Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. He gave an interview in 2012. He said, China's displacement of the world balance is such that the world must find a new balance. This is the biggest player in the history of the world. Now, by training and background, I'm a historian, archaeologist, and I think explaining this is the most useful thing that a historian and archaeologist can try to do. And the way I've looked at it has been looking at these long-term patterns, seeing what you see in this graph, but as part of a story going back many, many thousands of years, all the way back to the last ice age, in fact, looking at the very long-term patterns. And this is a graph that I produced of what I was calling social development in different parts of the world. A red line for the east, a blue line for the west, going back 16,000 years into the last ice age. Now, it's a long and complicated story. I'm not going to bore you to death by going on and march you through the whole story. I tried to tell the story in a book I wrote that was mentioned a moment ago, Wer regiert die Welt. And it's a story of generally rising levels of wealth and power around the world, but a story that affected different places in different ways. Why did it do that? Well, obvious reason, different places are different. Here, top left, you see Interlaken, beautiful place. Bottom right, you see the town where I grew up. Not such a beautiful place. Very different geography. They have very different histories. And what I convinced myself of doing this work was that basically geography is the most important force in history. Now, we can understand a lot of world history by thinking about how people have managed to use the geography that they live within, to respond to its challenges, to take advantage of its opportunities, with new forms of technology, new ways of organizing themselves. And one way to think about this, you could say, hey, 5,000 years ago, we lived in an age of great rivers. The most developed, the richest societies in the world were around the shores of rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, that they had gotten control of and started using to do their bidding. By 2,000 years ago, it was an age of small seas. The Romans conquer all of the shores of the Mediterranean basin, turn it into a single organization, political, economic organization, supporting the city of Rome. By 1,400 years ago, we've entered an age of artificial small seas. China didn't have anything like the Mediterranean, so they made their own Mediterranean. The Grand Canal joined together the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, created a kind of man-made Mediterranean basin for China. By 500 years ago, we'd entered the age of oceans. Western Europeans were able to take control of the North Atlantic Sea, use it to link them to the other oceans of the world, and the age of modern globalization really began. By 75 years ago, we'd entered the age of the greatest ocean, the Pacific Ocean, which is really, really big. I think this slide shows it nicely. And an age of kind of hyper-globalization began. Now, the lesson of all this, I think, is that geography is destiny. And this was the title of the most recent book I wrote that came out last year. It was a book I decided to write on June the 24th, 2016. I woke up in California that morning to discover that my fellow citizens in the British Isles had just voted to leave the European Union. And so I asked myself, inevitably, how does geography help us understand what just happened? And in writing this book, I mean, I always think the person who learns most from my books is me. All the mistakes I make actually teach me some lessons. Two big things that have jumped out at me. Yes, geography is destiny. Geography drives history, But history drives what geography means. As we respond to geography, invent new technologies, organizations, we change what geography means for us. So that's one thing. The other, geography is destiny, but it's up to us to decide what to do about it, to make it happen, as we say here this year. Now, in the British case, which I wrote about in this book, the British Isles, a cluster of islands off the northwest edge of the European mainland. Through almost all of their history, the British Isles had been Europe's poor cousins, in a sense. So everything big and important began off to the southeast in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, India, China, and kind of rolled downhill northwest until they ended up in the British Isles. Britain was the place that got everything last. And there it stopped. Britain was really the edge of the world because the Atlantic Ocean was uncrossable. Now, that was pretty much the story from about 10,000 years ago, when the rising sea levels after the Ice Age turned the British Isles into islands, up till about just 500 years ago. And at that point, new technologies, new kinds of organizations made it possible to open the Atlantic Ocean and start using it as a highway to the rest of the world, if people wanted to do that. Now, once that happened, it became very likely that somebody in Western Europe was going to begin being able to dominate the world, again, if they chose to do so. And the British were able to remake the world to look like this once they decided they wanted to exploit the new meanings of geography. And there were violent arguments within Britain, civil war, revolutions, but they push on down this path. They draw North America into a global system centered on London. Although by about 250 years ago, they start to lose control. The United States breaks away. By 150 years ago, the United States is pushing Britain out of the center of this global system. And by the 1900s, technology and organization are allowing the Americans to incorporate the Pacific Ocean as well and draw in East Asia into an American-dominated system. Now, basically, the same story keeps going. By the 1970s, it begins to look like Japan might displace the United States. By the 1990s, Japan, of course, goes into recession. By that time, 1990s, it looks like China might be displacing the United States. Well, now, as I'm sure many of you will know, a lot of people are talking about, we've already seen peak China. Chinese growth is slowing. I think this graph is great. This shows you different estimates made across the last 12 years of what the future trends in Chinese economic growth are going to be. And you'll see systematically revised downward across this period. But even if we were to believe the lowest of these estimates, the capital economics one, geography is still destiny. The East is still challenging the West. And in my own work, I did what I thought was sort of an interesting exercise, was to take the trends I'd identified in rising development in the East and West during the 20th century and project them forward and say, well, what will happen in the 21st century? And what we got was this, that the red eastern line caught up with and crossed the blue western line in the year 2103. Now, that is a great, precise prediction for you, and obviously slightly tongue-in-cheek. But what it means is, other things being equal, the East is closing the gap on the West. Now, the big question, of course, what to do about it? Now, one way to think about it is to look at what happened the last time we got a shift like this, 100 to 150 years ago. Back in the 1870s, when the British dominated the global system, Germany and the United States looked like they were simultaneously rivals and partners in the system, much the way many of us talk about China now. When German leaders made an active decision in 1890 to challenge British maritime superiority, the British started to move Germany from the rivals and partners column into just rivals column, and to move the United States into just potential allies column. Britain, the United States, France, Russia, of course, made alliances to defeat two German attempts to take over the system through violence in the 20th century. But the price the British paid was to subordinate themselves to the United States. And yet, the strange thing about this story is, by the 1970s, West Germany is the dominant economic power in Europe anyway, in spite of everything that happened. Geography was destiny. It was very, very hard to stop Germany from being Europe's greatest economic power. But on the other hand, what the alliances did was decide what sort of power is Germany going to be. And Willy Brandt was not the same thing as Adolf Hitler or the same thing as Kaiser Wilhelm. So geography was destiny, but people were able to do something about it. So the point of my little history lesson here, I think we're confronting some similar issues in the 2020s. Like Germany in 1890, Chinese leaders have made decisions about what kind of rising power they want to be. In the 1990s, Deng Xiaoping famously said, "Hide your capacities and bide your time. China should not be aggressive, not make itself a target." By 2014, Xi Jinping is saying, "Make China's voice heard. Inject more Chinese elements into international rules." Now, since the 1950s, Chinese leaders have felt that the alliances that the Americans built up after the Second World War, running the chain of alliances running down from Japan all the way to Australia, this was basically a way to constrain China, to trap it in. In more recent years, many American analysts look at the One Belt, One Road initiative and see this primarily as a way of outflanking the island chains, China breaking out of its containment. And every nation in the West is having its own internal debate about whether and how far to move China into the rivals column. Now, by about 2010, all the way from Korea down to Australia and China's near neighbors, they already were tending to feel their freedom of choice was constrained. They had to choose either the US or China as the primary ally. By about 2015, I think the same is happening in Europe. And I suggested in the book that I mentioned, my most recent book, that Brexit was ultimately a debate about what to do about these new meanings of geography. Well, what about Switzerland? Switzerland, very different place from Britain. Switzerland, landlocked, mountainous, has these enormous, scary neighbors in France and Germany. And in the 20th century, Swiss consistently pursued a policy of strict neutrality, providing financial services that it was often in the interests of the great powers to see these services coming out of a strictly neutral country. Very, very clever strategy that's worked extremely well. The question is, of course, does it still work extremely well? Switzerland, of course, is still where it used to be. Europeans are still its main trading partners. But when you look at this graph, number 2, 3, and 4, the United States, China, and Japan, the world is closing in. Neutrality is becoming more difficult. And this is what Gary Kasparov was saying yesterday. Neutrality is becoming more difficult. And the debate has clearly begun in Switzerland. Just in the last few weeks, I noticed following the news, Swiss representatives going out to Taiwan. This is a new thing. The Chinese ambassador has condemned the Swiss parliament. These are new things. The debate has begun. Everyone has to decide what geography means and then make it happen. Now, we can be very certain about how not to make it happen. And I say this because every major shift in power and wealth around the world in previous history has involved extreme violence, often in accidental, unpredicted ways. So say we go back to 1913. All the experts are worrying about a war between Britain and Germany. But what they worry about is a colonial war starting in Africa or the Pacific. What they get is a war that breaks out on the edge of a decaying Austro-Hungarian empire in Serbia, where the empire is trying to reassert itself. Now, in the 2020s, all the experts worry about America and China. They worry particularly about clashes in the South China Sea in Taiwan. What we're getting is a war on the edge of the decaying Russian empire as it tries to reassert itself. And Gary Kasparov, he did foresee this coming. Most of the rest of us did not, though. And this is very typical of the long pattern. Are we back in 1914, but now with nuclear weapons? Well, this, I like to call the next graph, I like to call it the happiest graph in history. It's a wonderful graph. It's the number of nuclear warheads in the world over time. They've come down by more than 90% since 1983. This is 86. This is an extraordinary thing that's happened. We no longer probably have the destructive power to end all life on Earth before I end this speech, which is going to be quite soon, I promise you. We do, though, have the power to refight World War II before I end this speech. This is what a military guy at Stanford told me. The next 30 years are going to be the most dangerous in history. So, to end, what will the destiny of the West be? Well, I'm certain of what it will not be. We're not going to see business as usual, what we've seen the last 250 years of the West continuing to dominate the planet and Europe playing this major part in that. And I think in part because of what President Novak mentioned yesterday, just the demographic changes that are going on. But what it will look like, I think that is up to all of us to decide. Will the West be a radioactive wasteland? One possibility. Will it be a satellite of China? Will it be more of a satellite of the United States? Will it be part of a multipolar, but perhaps more equal world? Will it be part of a world so transformed by technology that East and West no longer really mean much? The defining challenge of our century is going to be to decide what this graph really means, and then how to make it happen. So thank you very much for listening.
Ian Morris, thank you very much for joining me here just for some follow-up questions. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. I had some brilliant questions prepared, but we've got some great questions from the audience as well. So let me just start with one or two of those. Some very interesting ones. When you talk about geography, of course, we talk about geography down here, Earth. Mm-hmm. And there's a great question. How should we tackle the new geography in space? For example, when it comes to learnings, should we one day colonize the moon or Mars?
Yeah, great question. In fact, I think you can sort of open up the question even more and say there's more than one new kind of geography. There's also the new version of geography provided by the internet, basically, the digital world we've created. And a lot of analysts say this is what's actually transforming geopolitics more than anything. But yeah, the space stuff, clearly, the potential for economic exploitation of outer space is enormous. And so much of what we do down here on Earth, of course, depends on having this intact network of satellites. Mm-hmm. If the satellite network goes down, an awful lot of other stuff goes down. So, I mean, it wasn't totally surprising when Donald Trump announced he was going to form a new command in the US, the Space Command. Maybe the name is a bit silly, but the Space Command, not totally surprising. We're going to see more and more.
And we have new players up there as well. Does it worry you? For example, China coming into that space as well?
Well, it's to be expected. I mean, China would be a very strange great power if it didn't try to contest all of the most important geopolitical spaces. So we should expect this to happen. I think there's almost no way to prevent this from happening. But what we need to do is manage it in a way that isn't going to move us toward violent confrontation.
Another interesting question from the audience. We've been talking a lot about globalization in the last 2-3 decades. And with the pandemic already, but now as well, we're talking about, maybe kind of aspects of deglobalization. Are you expecting that trend to go on?
Yes and no. I think this all really depends on what sort of scale you're looking at. And so if you look at the long-term history, you can say the whole of human history, going back, arguably a couple of million years, it's all been a story of globalization. But humans spread out from where they initially evolved, and then society spread out and so on. But it's always been a very up and down, uneven, interrupted kind of story. And often people will say that the era we're living in now, modern hyperglobalization, this really takes off at the end of the 19th century with the railway and steam ships and telegraphs and all this kind of thing. But when you look at that 150-year history, it gets this huge interruption in 1914. The war causes a great breakdown of the global networks, and that doesn't really get booted back up again until after World War II, and then it really takes off with the fall of the Soviet Union, and now it's crashing back down again. It just seems like every time there's increasing tensions, geopolitical tensions, then people will try to decouple from globalized networks they can't really control. So I think what we're seeing now is going to continue. We are going to continue to see deglobalization, but this is not the shape of the future. This won't last forever.
Speaking of the future, a scary thought. At the moment, more people are ruled or live in societies and in countries which are led undemocratically. You scared me in an interview when you said, maybe the concept of democracy is at risk. Maybe it's old-fashioned. Do you see that risk for the future?
Yeah, I must say, this is not something I'm advocating, by the way. not
I reckon.
A good time. But yeah, democracy has not been around forever. It's got a very short history. And there's an ancient Greek version of democracy, which was one where women didn't vote and 1/3 of the population was slaves, if you want to call that democracy. Then the modern version is, of course, very recent. It goes back 200, 250 years. And it gets created when it does because it's a really good solution to the problems certain countries are facing at that time. And I think the 20th century showed it was still the best solution in confronting the Nazis and the Soviets. The big question now is it still the solution in the new world we're creating in the 21st century? And obviously, people in Beijing think not. And what we don't know who's right on this yet. We will find out, or I won't find out, but people younger than me will find out who's right on this.
To end up on a slightly higher note, although we're out of time, but a quick one in the end, because it's a question from the audience as well. Interesting one. We're at a business conference. Why do so many business persons and leaders not adequately consider the potential of history repeating itself?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one thing I found, speaking to business and financial groups, is just how interested people tend to be in long-term history, particularly if you're thinking about it kind of in the same way that a lot of financial analysts do. You look at the past to find clues about what's going to happen in the future. That's what they're doing. That's kind of what I'm doing. The problem is, like any skill set, it's really complicated to do it well. And actually, I think the problem tends not to be failure to look back for clues about what might happen next, but a failure to look back for clues of what might not happen next. And so, like when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, the government called in a lot of very knowledgeable historical consultants to advise on what might happen, what had happened in the past when the British took over Iraq after World War I. And what they didn't do was call in people who are going to come in and say, well, yes, those are all the similarities. That's very helpful for you. But these are the differences. This is what is not going to happen like the last time the British did it. And I think if they'd done a bit more of that, they might have gone about things a bit differently.
Fascinating and very insightful. Thank you very much, Ian Morris.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you.